Part 1. Experiences in a Concentration Camp. This book does not claim to be an account of facts and events, but of personal experiences which millions of prisoners have suffered time and again. It is the inside story of a concentration camp, told by one of its survivors. This tale is not concerned with the great horrors which have already been described often enough, though less often believed, but with the multitude of small torments. In other words, it will try to answer this question: how is everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of the average prisoner? Okay, so Dr. Frankl is opening the book by explaining that he's not here to give history and account of numbers. He's here to talk about practical, what was life like? How did the mind of a concentration camp prisoner reflect on, see itself, and how did they view the situation that they were in? How was everyday life in a concentration camp reflected in the mind of the average prisoner? Most of the events described here did not take place in the large and famous camps, but in the small ones where most of the real extermination took place. This story is not about the suffering and death of great heroes and martyrs, nor is it about the prominent capos, prisoners who acted as trustees, having special privileges, or well-known prisoners. So he's saying this is not to do with anything very big. Don't be looking into this book for very big stories and big and important heroes and martyrs, and it's not going to be about the capos. The capos were the people who the Nazis put in charge of other prisoners within the camps, and often they were as brutal or sometimes more than some of the Nazis, but those are the capos. Thus, it is not so much concerned with the sufferings of the mighty, but with the sacrifices, the crucifixion, and the deaths of the great army of unknown and unrecorded victims, meaning of the millions and millions of Jews who died, right? So there are some famous, prominent names that stand out and stick out. However, the vast majority of people that died were just, so to speak, nameless victims in the perspective of history. Obviously, each person was a person, an olam maleh, a complete world to himself. However, in the reflection of history, right, the masses of people that died are a great army of unknown and unrecorded victims. It was these common prisoners who bore no distinguishing marks on their sleeves, whom the capos really despised, right? Meaning these were not special people in any which way. They were not, from any higher society or anything like that, just the regular everyday people, and they were like the most hated people by the capos. While these ordinary prisoners had little or nothing to eat, the capos were never hungry. In fact, many of the capos fared better in the camp than they had in their entire lives. Often they were harder on the prisoners than were the guards, and beat them more cruelly than the SS men did. So this is Dr. Frankl reflecting on the role of the capos and how they took advantage of their situation to not only enrich themselves and feed themselves, but also to torture the prisoners. These capos, of course, were chosen only from those prisoners whose characters promised to make them suitable for such procedures. And if they did not comply with what was expected of them, they were immediately demoted. So, meaning Dr. Frankl is explaining that the Nazis picked people who they knew would be suitable for this role, meaning they picked from the prisoners those people that were the most cruel and most likely to follow directions and be willing to hurt their fellow Jews. They soon became much like the SS men and the camp wardens, and may be judged on a similar psychological basis. So he's really grouping the capos together with the Nazis over here. It is easy for the outsider to get the wrong conception of camp life, a conception mingled with sentiment and pity. Little does he know of the hard fight for existence which raged among the prisoners. This was an unrelenting struggle for daily bread and for life itself, for one's own sake or for that of a good friend. So he's saying, meaning, don't be expecting there to be any sort of sentimental and sweet, pitiful type of scenes being painted in this book. That's not what it was like in the camps. In the camps, it was a brutal, hard-fought fight for survival, for every piece of bread, for one's own sake, or for that of a good friend. Let us take the case of a transport which was officially announced to transfer a certain number of prisoners to another camp. but it was a fairly safe guess that its final destination would be the gas chambers. A selection of sick or feeble prisoners incapable of work would be sent to one of the big central camps which were fitted with gas chambers and crematoriums. The selection process was the signal for a free fight among all the prisoners, or of group against group. All that mattered was that one's own name and that of one's friend were crossed off the list of victims, though everyone knew that for each man saved, another victim had to be found, meaning they knew that there were transports that were being made of people that they felt were too weak and feeble to continue to work. They knew that those transports almost certainly meant being sent to death. So every single person would struggle and do whatever they could do, bribing guards, trying everything they could to get their names or names of their friends and loved ones off of those lists, even though they knew that doing so was condemning somebody else to take their place. A definite number of prisoners had to go with each transport. It did not really matter which, since each of them was nothing but a number. Meaning each prisoner, the Nazis didn't care who came, they just needed 300 people, so 300 people had to go. On their admission to the camp, at least this was the method in Auschwitz, all their documents had been taken from them together with their other possessions. Each prisoner, therefore, had had an opportunity to claim a fictitious name or profession, and for various reasons many did this, meaning everybody came in without any papers and without any history, essentially, so people could make up a new name and make up a new profession that they never did before, and people would sometimes do this in order to save their lives. The authorities were interested only in the captives' numbers. These numbers were often tattooed on their skin and also had to be sewn to a certain spot on their trousers, jacket, or coat. Any guard who wanted to make a charge against a prisoner just glanced at his number, and how we dreaded such glances. He never asked for his name. This is a major aspect of the dehumanization, is that everybody was just given a number. These are the famous tattoos that we know on the numbers of prisoners from the concentration camps. To return to the convoy about to depart, so he's getting back to the story he mentioned earlier, that there was this truck that was going to be leaving the camp and going to a place where they assumed people were going to all be killed. There was neither time nor desire to consider moral or ethical issues. Every man was controlled by one thought only, to keep himself alive for the family waiting for him at home and to save his friends. With no hesitation, therefore, he would arrange for another prisoner, another number, to take his place in the transport. Meaning prisoners would see each other also like numbers. As I have already mentioned, the process of selecting capos was a negative one. Only the most brutal of the prisoners were chosen for this job, although there were some happy exceptions. But apart from the selection of capos, which was undertaken by the SS, there was a sort of self-selecting process going on the whole time among all of the prisoners. On the average, only those prisoners could keep alive who, after years of trekking from camp to camp, had lost all scruples in their fight for existence. They were prepared to use every means, honest or otherwise, even brutal force, theft, and betrayal of their friends, in order to save themselves. We who have come back by the aid of many lucky chances or miracles, whatever one may choose to call them, we know the best of us did not return. So this is a very powerful statement that he's making over here, Dr. Frankl, but he's saying that the people that lasted for years in the camps were people that used every means at their disposal, honest or otherwise, brutal, theft, betrayal of their friends, right? People were forced to do so many things that they would never do in regular life in order to save themselves and try to live through their time in the concentration camps. Many factual accounts about concentration camps are already on record. Here, facts will be significant only as far as they are part of a man's experiences. It is the exact nature of these experiences that the following essay will attempt to describe. For those who have been inmates in a camp, it will attempt to explain their experiences in the light of present-day knowledge. And for those who have never been inside, it may help them to comprehend, and above all to understand, the experiences of that only too small percentage of prisoners who survived and who now find life very difficult. These former prisoners often say, "We dislike talking about our experiences. No explanations are needed for those who have been inside, and the others will understand neither how we felt then, nor how we feel now." In other words, Dr. Frankl is saying that these experiences were so traumatic and so overwhelming that for most people, it's impossible for them to comprehend. People who didn't experience it can't possibly comprehend what happened, and people who did can't possibly articulate what happened, so then there's just no way to bridge that gap. But that's what he's going to try to do. To attempt a methodical presentation of the subject is very difficult, as psychology requires a certain scientific detachment. But does a man who makes his observations while he himself is a prisoner possess the necessary detachment? Such detachment is granted to the outsider, but he is too far removed to make any statements of real value. Only the man inside knows. His judgments may not be objective, his evaluations may be out of proportion. This is inevitable. An attempt must be made to avoid any personal bias, and that is the real difficulty of a book of this kind. So he's explaining to us that he's really trying to approach this subject scientifically. He's trying to discuss the psychology of people who go through an experience like this, and he's explaining how a person who didn't have that experience can't possibly assess it, and a person who did have the experience is automatically biased. There's a built-in bias that is going to affect the way that he sees it, and that by definition is not scientific. So he says this is an inevitable problem in trying to do this, but he has to try. So an attempt must be made to avoid any personal bias, and that is the real difficulty of a book of this kind. At times it will be necessary to have the courage to tell of very intimate experiences. I had intended to write this book anonymously, using my prison number only. But when the manuscript was completed, I saw that as an anonymous publication it would lose half its value, and that I must have the courage to state my convictions openly. I therefore refrained from deleting any of the passages in spite of an intense dislike of exhibitionism. This is very powerful. Dr. Frankl is saying that he wrote this originally intending to publish it anonymously, and therefore wrote very, very personal, intimate details and experiences that he had, intending to have the book published without anybody knowing that it was him. However, when he realized that in order for the book to have the effect and the impact that he wanted it to have, he would have to publish it with his name, he made that decision to publish it with his name, and was extremely courageous in not deleting any of those very personal aspects of the book. So that's a very courageous and wonderful thing that he did for all of us, leaving in these very personal details, very intimate explanations of his thoughts and his feelings, even though he printed it in his own name. I shall leave it to others to distill the contents of this book into dry theories. These might become a contribution to the psychology of prison life, which was investigated after the First World War, and which acquainted us with the syndrome of barbed wire. We are indebted to the Second World War for enriching our knowledge of the psychopathology of the masses, if I may quote a variation of the well-known phrase and title of a book by